This was the scene in the liberal college town of Charlottesville, Virginia on Friday, reminiscent of images from a dark American past.
This is our town now!
Hundreds of white nationalists from across the country descended upon the University of Virginia's campus ahead of a planned demonstration to protest the removal of the statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee.
White lives matter! White lives matter!
They quickly clashed with counter-protesters, people from both sides ready to fight. It would be the start of a bloody 24 hours.
I remember watching these images flash across my television and cell phone screen in August of 2017. I remember the feeling of dread watching fellow Americans screaming, beating, hurting one another in broad daylight. I remember too the feeling of shock and confusion when I learned that all of these terrible things were happening just because of a statue. I remember being afraid. I remember watching these things unfold in that late summer, days before I would begin my own journey into our country and the world. Just a few short days after the violence at Charlottesville, I would begin my pursuit of an undergraduate degree in history at Colorado State. At that point, I was only very dimly aware that I would be studying the very same thing that was at the center of the terror that I was seeing in our country. Our history. Then, in the summer of 2020, another wave of protests and unrest rocked not just the city of Charlottesville, but the entirety of our nation. Once again, statues were a focus and target of our discontent. The weight of memory hangs on the United States. The weight of our dark, complex, and hidden history lays heavy on us and our identity. As Sanford Levison writes in his book Written in Stone, the American society is not made up of one singular public, but of many groups that relate differently to conflicting symbologies. Public monuments commemorating the short-lived Confederacy of the Civil War have become a flashpoint in discussions about our shared past. Arguments for and against their removal are all deeply rooted in the value of our history and in the struggle to identify what is worth remembering in our public symbols. But our nation has reached a critical point. Political polarization, economic disparity, and increasing senses of hostility and isolation have made conversations about our past difficult and even dangerous. We must recognize a new way forward, one focused on education, empowerment, and healing. And if we do not, the weight of memory may well crush us. This memorial illustrates the arguments in favor of the preservation of Confederate monuments. Now, these arguments are often based in what is called the lost cause narrative. As John Winberry writes, it was a cause that had struggled for liberty and rights, but preserved honor and sacrifice, a sense that these precious commodities constituted the core of the Southern identity. The lost cause is a way of understanding the Southern secession as a courageous statement of state and individual freedom in the face of imposing federal authority. The preservation of honor and a sense of self-sacrifice for oneself mark this interpretation of the Civil War. In other words, the importance of the Civil War was in the fact that men and women of the South fought courageously for a cause that they believed to be truly just, but were overwhelmed by the power and resources of the federal government. Winberry also writes, in 1895, the United Daughters of the Confederacy was organized in Atlanta and involved itself with a number of projects, including the memorialization of the lost cause. The monuments were a way to physically preserve the spirit that these men laid down their lives for. As the monument quotes John 15, "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." Fighting for liberty in the face of impossible odds is a worthy cause indeed. The institution of enslavement based on race scars the history of our nation. Centuries of oppression, inhumanity, and violence in many ways remain hidden from us even today. As anthropologist Bailey Duhay argues, the statues reflect a one-sided interpretation of history, writing, The questions around the monument removal focus on a singular experience and a one-sided version of history, leaving more excluded from these conversations than is included. She, along with many others, would argue that Confederate statues legitimize the secession of the South only as an attempt to protect the institution of human enslavement. Communities of color are silenced in that process, and by valorizing and romanticizing the leaders of the Confederacy, the experience of millions of enslaved Africans in America is ignored. Duhay also points out that the timing of the dedication of these statues, around the turn of the 20th century, suggests that they were put in place to legitimize the practices of segregation and discrimination in the Jim Crow South. And these practices lasted another 100 years after the end of slavery. Now this raises the important question. What value would Southern communities of color find in these monuments? Were these men and women truly fighting for them and their families? The answer plainly is no. Confederate monuments in many ways reflect a romanticized vision of the Southern past, honoring the struggle for liberty while ignoring the denial of those very same liberties to millions. A sense of the past is powerful. It provides a sense of identity, and it gives one a feeling of belonging and purpose. And despite deeply conflicting ideas about the value of these Confederate monuments, the interpretations, both for and against, each illustrate an essential truth about why these things are so significant. They are significant in the simple fact that they are a reflection of ourselves and our relationship to our past. In commenting on the monument question, researcher Alex Barker makes an important distinction in this debate between the idea of history and our heritage, or a herited history. He writes, "The human past represents the lived experience of people, the social relationships, structures, and processes that organize their lives, while heritage, on the other hand, is what we make of that past and its salience for our current communities." In other words, our nation's history exists in two respects: the events that actually made up the historical experience of our ancestors, and how we in the present make meaning from what we understand about those experiences. So in this sense, it could be said that the proponents and opponents of Confederate monument removal are talking straight past one another. Those who defend the preservation of the monuments are focusing on the past and the lived experience of the men and women in their own time. With or without the institution of slavery, they certainly believed that they were fighting for a just cause, and in our time, that should be worthy of remembrance. Those in favor of monument removal focus on the present, recognizing the experience of marginalized communities and groups in this nation, recognizing the one-sided story that these statues are telling, and how the voices of these communities of color are not being heard. In a sense, then, each side is attempting to impose their understanding of history as being correct, rather than understand where the opposition is actually coming from. This brings us to the here and now. As Alex Barker accurately observes, what we choose to do now has direct implications on our relationship with our past, and how we start to put our broken identity back together. We must find another way to relate to these monuments that does not necessarily focus on one interpretation or the other. From here, I propose a solution that has two simple and significant parts. In moving the monuments to less imposing areas of the community, off of street corners or city plazas, they lose their political potency while retaining their historical meaning and significance. When we ground their significance in a space of education and healing, such as local museums, individuals will have the space they need to approach these monuments and their legacy with impartiality, not necessarily indifference. An impartial site will empower historically marginalized stories and communities and encourage them to come forward. Imagine people with their diverse perspectives and different understandings of American history gathering to learn about their shared past through these historical markers, recognizing the truth that they both enshrined and concealed for so long. But the most important part of this solution is that the communities which house these Confederate monuments make these decisions and actions on their own. It is the responsibility of someone like me, universities, and political organizations to help educate and support, but it is never the place of any external force to impose their will on those who live with these monuments. The events of Charlottesville in 2017 became so explosive primarily because of the huge influx of external, radical actors who did not have the best interests of the community at heart. The dangers of those events were only agitated and amplified by a significant media presence, sparking nationwide anger, confusion, and resentment. Empowering our communities to make these decisions from the bottom up will end the historic oppression from the top down. This may give them the opportunity to create a new path and lead our nation down a road of reconciliation, healing, and awareness. History is not the past, it is the present. We make our history each day of our lives. Our history is not about some past events, but about what those things truly mean to us today. The situation in which we approach these monuments is a dire one indeed. It seems that nothing truly works anymore, that people cannot talk to one another, that we simply cannot see one another. But we cannot afford to look away anymore. I truly believe that our history can unite us as firmly as it may have divided us up to now. These conversations are and will be difficult. They never were easy. But if we begin to use our history not as a microscope, but as a mirror, we may begin to see one another and ourselves. We are our history. If we choose a path of education, healing, and progress, then we will find it, and we will make it. Relocating these monuments to a space which allows this process is only part of the solution, but is a necessary step if we are to overcome the darkness of our past. What is important now is that we recognize these Confederate monuments for what they are, not as an obstacle to be overcome or a sacred treasure to be safeguarded, but they are tools which can help propel us forward to a new sense of identity and purpose. And maybe then, when we begin to see these monuments for what they truly are, we can ease the burden imposed by the weight of memory.